All right, we're back. We are back from outer space. Brian with City of the Immaculata. Good to be back with you folks. I know it's been a while. It's been almost, oh gosh, I guess it's been all summer at this point. It's been quite the summer. I have a lot of updates for you guys. I will probably dedicate a stream to that at some point. But we're all doing well here at the City of the Immaculata. New abode, new residence, new state, new life, new existence, all of these things, and ready to get back into this. I've actually kind of missed doing these lives. For the foreseeable future, it probably won't be as often as it had been in the past, maybe once or twice a month as opposed to like every Monday. But the goal is to get back into doing this somewhat consistently. So, without further ado, for today's discussion, I wanted to begin with my return with a topic that is probably one of the most discussed and thoroughly abused of discussions in today's discourse online. This is the topic of the state of manhood in modern society, in the modern world. And as a social observer, being the social observer that I am, and I mean that really kind of in the truest sense, I was actually at one time, I was thinking about this as I was putting this lecture together. I was at one time what you would consider a people watcher. Do any of you guys remember people watchers? Do they still exist? Are they still out there? Or is that considered like, passé, right? Is it a thing of the past, and it would be considered weird now to just kind of sit in a public forum and kind of watch people? But I used to like sitting in a public space and just kind of watching people go about their day. People are kind of interesting when they don't know that they're being watched, and you're not doing it like in a creepy way. You're just trying to see how people interact with one another and interact with the world around them. I imagine if somebody were doing that today, there would probably be some kind of secret police coming up to you for you're having shown too much signs of humanity. I can tell you I don't do it anymore myself, and I can tell you why I don't do it anymore. And it's because I didn't change so much as people have changed. To sit in the public forum today and watch people, you would basically be watching a bunch of automatons who are just glued to this little device in their hands, and they've channeled out the whole world around them. So they're really not doing anything interesting anymore. But to the best of my ability, I still try to observe people. And there's, as you well know, there are all kinds of people online. All of them, unfortunately, have voices. The most humorous, and in regards to this particular conversation, the most pathetic, and I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, just kind of in the truest sense of the word, are the women out there who are trying to figure out the problem of the condition of manhood in the modern world. And granted, women are on the receiving end of the problem, and I wholly admit that there is a problem, as we will get into here today. I don't deny that aspect of this. But they themselves, they have a reason to want to see a society in which men are lifted up, as that only benefits women in the long run. The problem that I see with a lot of the women that are online giving advice to men is that many, at least the ones that I have seen, and I'm sure maybe you as well, many of them do not want to accept that the source of the problem, as well as the compromise that may have to take place on some of the quote unquote progress that they've made, may have to happen before there could actually be a situation in which men could be elevated. A lot of these women will like pretzel themselves every which way to avoid having to say a word like, oh, I don't know, submit. Even when like modern men will grant all of the nuances to the word and all of the obligations required of the man to be worthy of such a thing as a woman's submission. Look, the burden of good leadership requires that you place your own will to the side in place of a greater obedience, even if that decision may not be the one that you want to make. I think any man would acknowledge that in the realm of like something like, say, military leadership, the general is the one who calls the shots. The soldiers obey. Now, of course, a good leader has to have the trust, if not the affection, at the very least, the trust of his men, of his followers. And I could see that as being easily the reason why many women do not like the word submit, as they do not trust the men that they see around them. They do not ultimately trust their ability to lead. And we'll address that. But I do think there's also the taboo of, this is all the progress that we've made in the last 100 years. We want men to be elevated, but we also don't want to unravel any of the so-called progress that we've made. On the other sphere of the conversation is a more potent, more, dare I say, diabolical side that actually, I don't think when the women are attempting to fix the men, so to speak, that it's actually gaining much traction. But there is another side that actually sort of lures young men and even older men in. And many of these ideas are particularly dangerous because they lack the key element that made Western culture specifically here. It's mainly going to be a look at the condition of men in Western culture. But the ideas that these people are presenting are void of the unique aspects of the ethical system built on the gospel within Western culture for the last 2,000 years. And that is what I really want to get at here, because much of the advice that I see bandied about is that modern men are, it begins with this diagnosis that modern men are, the common words you'll see out there thrown around are like they're beta or they're cucked or whatever the word is that you want to use. The question that arises for me, though, just to start things off when I hear this is, you take a term like beta, right? Are Christian men beta? Right from the outset, we have to acknowledge that we have a faith whose founder says that he is the alpha, right? The presumption here is that by beta, that the men aren't being alpha, right? They're not being the top dogs. But there is no sense in the Christian context in which anybody is alpha outside of he who is alpha. And not only is he alpha, he's alpha and omega. He's first and last. So if we acknowledge that, right, that key point, the next follow-up question that I would have then, just to maybe give credence to some of the problems that we see in the modern world, is, does that actually by default make men weaker? If you have these group of Western men who say, look, we are Christian, we place ourselves under the headship of the kingship of Christ. Christ is the alpha, the omega. He is the alpha man. None of us are the alpha men. We are by default the beta men. There's the what I call him, the commentator, the social commentator out there, Andrew Tate, who whenever I see him, whenever he comes across my screen, I'll see him speaking about this quite often whenever I see him actually speak on things. And he's a guy that actually kind of picks up on this specifically. I see him bring this up about Christianity quite often, that the Christian men have allowed themselves to become too weak. But the thing that I have yet to see from any of these people on any sides of any of these spectrums actually do is apply an historical lens to the question. They all have answers, mind you. They all have opinions, man and woman both, on how to fix the problem, yet none of them seem to know exactly what they are restoring manhood to. There's this sort of fanciful idea that they all want, yet no one has anything nearing a unified, cohesive definition of what manhood should look like, what it did look like historically, and I'm talking anciently historically, then what it looked like during the Christian period, and now what is beginning to look like on the tail end of the postmodern period. Now, call me biased, those of you that have followed this channel for a while, but as someone who likes to look at things through the historical lens, this is like trying to work through a complex math problem, without having any idea of what kind of answer that you should be looking for. The people that are like presenting solutions that have no context whatsoever, maybe they have a context that goes back to like the 1950s, but on this grand scheme of things, that actually isn't very helpful if we're trying to return to something. Because by the 1950s, for those of you that are actually history buffs like myself, you would know by the 1940s, the 1950s, the world was upside down anyways by that point. You're almost too late at that point if that is your mark, your demarcation for what we want to try to return to. You're trying to return to something that's well beyond after the collapse, if you will, of the Christian moral ethos. History is the marker we use for saying, okay, this is kind of what it looked like. This is how people were. This is how they responded, etc., when they had a certain mindset and a certain frame of reference to the world around them. And then we can kind of begin gauging, we can begin comparing that to what's happened today. So right off, before we go anywhere, I think you have to know exactly how radical and how drastic a change the Christian ethics were to the old European society, and how society was changed as a result of the introduction of Christianity. And this, I think, is the easiest aspect of this to lose sight of, both in how we were before the arrival of Christianity and how we are now that it's disintegrating for the last 200-300 years. We've been running on the fumes of an ethical revolution that is all but over. And so what I want to see is not a change to something new, but in fact, a reversion to something that is very, very old, that Christians had in fact overturned. Excuse me. What I see, I think I said what I want to see. No, it's not what I want to see. What I do see, rather, is a return to something very old, something that predates Christianity. What's happening right now, it's not the new thing, it's the old thing. It's a return of the old thing. It's the thing that Christians had come along and overthrown in the first place. Recently, and this kind of makes me think about it, I saw on the YouTube news channel called Breaking Points, if any of you guys have ever seen that. It's run by, I forget the guy's name, but they've got a host on there named Ryan Grimm, I believe is his name. And it's kind of like an alternate news channel. I watch it every once in a while. It tends to lean a little bit like libertarian, but it's a news channel without the utter annoyingness you'd find in some mainstream media channels. So I'll turn to it every once in a while. Anyway, they were interviewing an author. I'm sorry, I can't remember the author's name, but he had written a book on this very topic, the topic of the Christian cultural revolution. And Grimm was challenging this author about whether it was indeed a revolution, because Grimm seemed to assume that all ethics are basically intrinsic and universal. I guess that was that seemed to be the position that he held to. And the odd thing was that this author seemed a bit stumped, and maybe it's that he wasn't prepared to defend his thesis. He probably thought he was going on just to plug his book, but still. And the thing is that Grimm kind of snidely is sitting here like assuming that something like Confucianism, for example, was comparable with what happened in Christianity, in the Christian scene. But, even just a cursory glance, had I been the one being pressed about this, even just a cursory glance by someone familiar with what the context was, this could easily have been nipped, fairly quickly. Because the first assumption is that the morality is comparable both in content and in audience. Now, granted, of all the ones that you could pick, Confucianism is a fairly great ethical system by and large, but it's not nearly as radical as Christianity. The Christian story truly upends most of human history up to that point, where for the first time, the lowest, the least of society were the ones that were blessed by not the gods, but by God Himself, by the invisible God who has now revealed Himself, creator of all. So even with Confucianism, even with, say, the Roman mystery religions, certainly with most religions throughout history, anyways, reward was based on merit, on birthright, on one's place as high in the strata of society. Then Christ comes along and says, no, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. Christ comes along and says, blessed are the meek, blessed are those that mourn for righteousness, all of these things today that we just kind of take for granted. And He says that man's illness is not due to the sins of the fathers, which is kind of a truly radical departure from the ancient world. Christ comes and He stands in judgment, actually, of most of human history and human actions. The light of Christ, the light of Christ shone not just forward, but also backwards on history up to that point. It shines towards us and it shines towards the eschaton, which is mostly what we tend to think about, but it also shone back on history up to that point, up to the point of the incarnation. And if you doubt this, oh, you Ryan Grimms of the world out there, just look at how the world responded, not just to Christ, but to Christians. Notice how when you get to a St. Martin of Tours, when he tore his cloak, how this caused a popular sensation, how it caused a popular uproar. Here you have Martin, a Roman soldier, someone seen as, for many centuries, sacred within the empire, who was relatively high on the social strata of the day, fairly high up on that ladder in Roman society. Most of the troops of St. Martin's Day are caught up in the cult of Mithras. But Martin, from a young age, is touched by the message of the gospel, and one day on his horse, he sees this beggar. Think of the beggar, right? The lowest of society, the lowest of the low, the ones that the gods have despised. Clearly, look at his fate. Martin sees this beggar, has pity and compassion on this beggar, rips his soldier's cloak. Now, mind you, the significance of that, rips his soldier's cloak, a sign of his power and status, and clothes the beggar. Then that night, he dreams. He dreams that it was Christ Himself, right, the God of all of the universe, that He clothed. This act caught the attention of everyone. It was transformative. It was revolutionary. Today, we are so enculturated by Christian ethics, no one bats an eye at that. People on YouTube break in tons of dough by doing random acts of kindness for the lowly. But at this time, it was so unheard of, it was so taboo that it became one of the most famous fables of the early church. His cloak was actually one of the most famous relics of the entire Middle Ages. And this happens time and time again in the ancient world. Yes, Christianity manages to convert the lower classes, as you could imagine, understandably so. But I think part of the real revolution of this whole thing is that it does something to the upper strata as well. It makes them all pause. Even the ones that don't convert, they pause. It makes them reflect on their views and how they view others and how they view themselves. Even the ones that didn't convert, right? You see these people in history moved in some respects by the message of the gospel. We have Attila the Hun in the 5th century coming up to the gates of Rome. And what does he see when he is attempting to invade Rome? He doesn't see soldiers. He's met by the Bishop of Rome, armed not with the sword, but with his crozier. And that makes Attila, we don't know what that conversation was between Attila and Pope St. Leo, but whatever it was, something inside of Attila was moved, was touched by the message of this man and the image of this man meeting him. And Attila turns around and Rome is spared. I think you see it in the later accounts of St. Francis and the story with the Sultan during the crusade when St. Francis went and meets with the Sultan, and the Sultan is facing a crusading army, and here emerging out of that crusading army is this man in beggar's clothes who comes to preach to him this message of the God of the poor and the destitute and the low. And this the hagiographical stories of this Sultan's how he was moved by St. Francis are quite beautiful in their own way. Speaking of Islam, even the desert dwelling Arabs, I am convinced that they were affected by the message. Now, of course, much of Islam's history is lost under a layer of sand and obfuscation from their apologists, but one thing that many Westerners I see fail to acknowledge in their discussion of Islam is that Islam, for its time and its place, kind of what we've been talking about here, right, was actually seen as a pacifying religion. And I know everyone today, in today's context, they put the modern lens on and judge it by those standards. But for the violence of its day, this is where history is helpful once again. The desert tribes pre-Islam were actually quite brutal in their traditional warfare. Muhammad comes along, and I believed, however remotely influenced, but I believe he was influenced somewhere by the Christian Revolution that had taken place in the centuries up to his life. And he places, for his time, strict regulations on the conduct of war. We look at it today and say there's actually a lot of violence allowed, but it's nothing to compare to what was allowed before with the treatment of children and women. Even the fact that there was any stipulations whatsoever being like any regulations whatsoever being applied was for their own people quite revolutionary. And this actually kind of gets to my main thesis. I'm not going to go off on a tangent about Islam, but this is that the Christianity does actually make men more passive. And why do I say that? Because it takes the tendencies of the powerful. In men, there are clearly men who are more powerful and capable of violence, certainly than women, but also certain men even more so than other men. And it takes those men and places pretty severe restrictions on what is and isn't allowable. Let's just take just war theory, for example. Now, this isn't directly from the gospel. Some modern liberal Christians will argue that it's actually antithetical to the gospel. But the idea here is that as you're moving centuries away from Christ and the coalition of the letters of Scripture into the canon of the gospel and the message is spreading, you're still stuck with the reality that human beings had been living in for the centuries leading up to all of this, which is that violence, warfare, all of these things are just a part of our sojourn. Now, if we accept that fact, if we acknowledge that there will be places and times in which, in order to survive, a Christian population may have to defend itself, then it's good to have some rules of conduct. And these come directly from Augustine. They have been adapted at a fairly high level by the ordinary magisterium. You can find it in the Catechism, but basically the outliers of the just rule theory are as thus. 1, the damage inflicted by the aggressor on the nation or community of nations must be lasting, grave, and certain. All other means of putting an end to it must have been shown to be impractical or ineffective. 3, there must be serious prospects of success. 4, the use of arms must not produce evils and disorders graver than the evil to be eliminated. The power of modern means of destruction weighs very heavily in evaluating this condition. Now, to the untrained ear, these may sound simple enough. But I had a friend once, a military buff, not a Catholic, and we were discussing this, and I read these out to him, and he's one of the smartest military historians I know personally. And when he heard this, he was like, "Wow, like holy cow, this makes fighting almost impossible for Catholics." If you truly were to apply these to real life scenarios, they are almost impossible to meet. And I pondered on that for a long time. And the conclusion that I came to was that is clearly the point. The historical manly tendency is to glorify war and fighting and strength. And look, I get it. I'm a military buff myself. I love the history of war and fighting, and I will nerd out on military tactics. I get the appeal to it. I love martial arts. I deep down I love fighting. I totally get it. But is it the ideal way that we should be acting? Men of the past, and I'm talking about real men, right? Tough guys who were tougher than you or me or 3 of us put together. They struggled with this. I'm just about finished a book that I'm working on. And in the research, I went through all of these old stories of the conversions of barbarians. And it's wild, man. It's wild to see them grapple with the reality that their lifestyle could very well lead them to damnation. These guys knew it. But do you know that? You ortho bros out there, or you tough guy trads, or whoever you are, some of y'all are famous for this stuff, especially with your physiognomy checks or whatever it is that y'all are trying to do to man each other up. I see y'all longing for the Crusades, but realize this, and this is one of the things I don't think is emphasized anywhere near enough about the Crusades. The only reason that the Crusades were feasible, the only reason that they were as successful as they were, is because Pope Urban II, in his providential genius, attached an indulgence with it. That is why those men went and fought. Not for the sake of the glory of battle, not even necessarily for the sake of the kingdom, though that was certainly a part of it, but it wasn't just carte blanche, go fight for the kingdom. It was, hey, we know this life that we've been living. There's no way that we can atone for the things that we have done. There's no amount of penance that I can perform that was going to get me out of purgatory. And these guys feared purgatory to such an extent that the plenary indulgence offered to the crusader was more than they could turn down. It gave their skill, their weakness, and their strength. It gave it all this atoning outlet. Wrap your mind around that. If you have to, pause, go back, think about it. These men were the elite soldier classes of their days. They were tougher than you and I will ever be in our lives. They knew that they were going to be answerable. All this alpha bro stuff that these guys think that they're into today, these tough guys today. But I'll admit, right, and I think it's easy for me to admit, but I think if those that are hesitant to want to acknowledge that society needs strong men, right? If you can get these people to acknowledge, those that are hesitant about these sort of arguments, that society needs fighting men. In order for a society to survive, it needs fighting men. I think it's also fair for us as Christians to acknowledge that it is a conundrum. Some, before the crusading period, some of these fighting men of this medieval era, before the crusading period, would offer land to the church. which was, knights by title owned land. So they would endow certain amounts of land to the church to build monasteries, so that in turn monks would come to the monasteries to dedicate themselves to praying for these soldiers, for the acts that these soldiers knew that they were going to have to commit in their lifetimes. From Clovis to Charlemagne on down the line, these guys killed. They killed with their bare hands. They knew that it was, even if it was necessary, they knew that it was an evil and that it endangered their souls. By building up the church, they weren't just adding prestige to their courts, they were also atoning for their sins. William of Aquitaine is a good example of this. He's a rough dude. He's killed men. He's worried about the state of his soul so much that he does something very unique when he endows land to the church. He actually gets a charter to have the church under the stewardship, under the control of the papacy in Rome, which frees it from its obligations to the local nobles, because William knew that after his death, what often happened in the Middle Ages was these people, like I say, I'm a knight and I endow land to the church. The church builds a monastery. For a few years, the monks are dedicated to praying for my soul after I die. But then the nobles that are left living, they have other purposes, either for the land or for the monks. So the monks get distracted by, maybe they got to go till the land or something like that. So William says, no, I want these monks dedicated to praying for me in perpetuity. So he hands it over to the papacy, which in turn, his concern eventually leads to the independence of the church from state powers in the form of the Gregorian reforms, but that's a different story. Now, I have talked about this before, but the ethics of chivalry have a long pedigree of Christianity working in and through the culture before something like a chivalric code could emerge in the warrior class. And even then, the code between knights, right? A knight of this country, a knight of this province versus a knight of that province over there, the code that emerges between them could only be brought about, could only emerge within the Christian ethical context, where it's Christian brother forced to fight Christian brothers. Other people, especially as knights began to, and Christian fighters began to fight outside of the context of Christian fighting Christian in Europe, other peoples kind of laughed at this code, and they even played it against us militarily, as chivalry only really works when everyone is playing by the rules. And there's not a broken line between the chivalric code of medieval Europe and, say, the so-called human rights campaigns that you see within the United Nations today. Those were born out of the chivalric code of the Middle Ages. But it takes a certain society to produce that, right? You don't just get the United Nations like stipulations on how to treat prisoners of war and things like that. You don't just get that. It's not created out of a vacuum, as Ryan Grimm would believe or have you believe. Warfare, unhinged from the restraints of chivalry, began rearing its ugly head in the 20th century, a century that has been washed in blood. And many of the proponents of the demise of Christianity themselves reveled in the fact that the kind of warfare that they were able to conduct in the 20th century, they weren't necessarily constrained by the moral code of chivalry. As far back as Nietzsche, even before the wars of the 20th century, you see Nietzsche himself lamenting the state of modern warriors. Because Nietzsche had this like fanciful view of how glorious things could have been had not the Christian world. You see this as well, like in the Edward Gibbons, as he wrote, if you've ever read the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Gibbons, he was given to this sort of like the decline of the empire was due to Christianity and the Christian ethics, and he was given to this sort of fanciful views of what may have happened, like had Julian the Apostate actually succeeded in reviving paganism. Nietzsche sort of had these fanciful views of how glorious things could have been had the Christian civilization not taken hold. And granted, and I will give this to Nietzsche as opposed to the people that you would argue with today, Nietzsche was masterfully versed in the classics. He knew that the arrival of Christianity was a ethical revolution, a cultural, social revolution. He knew that this revolution had tamed that wild spirit of the heroic warriors of the past. Nietzsche would love to have had a modern day telling of like a Hannibal and a Scipio. In many sense, he wasn't wrong about the way and the direction that things are kind of taking place today, though we only we find today that it's not so much these, well, I mean, I don't know, things, let me not eat my words here, but as of September 23rd, 2024, we're not engaged in any massive scale warfares. The technology advanced so fast that the scale of warfare is drastically reduced in the last 70 years or so. I could end up eating those words by the time that this goes out to the ether world of the internet. But God willing, most of the struggle is on a societal level, on a communal level. And when Nietzsche says that the Christianity creates a cultural context, a cultural zeitgeist where it makes a dictatorship of the slave, right? Where the slave actually becomes the master of the weak, become master over the masters. And one has to but read the Beatitudes, right, to get a sense that it's not completely incorrect. But again, he's looking at it more from the kind of like warfare that was still in play when he was alive. Whereas today, I think it's going to be a little bit more on the societal level on how, men interact with society as a whole, how they interact with other men. Is there still a place for is there still a place for violent men in society today? Now, I say contrast contrast the man of the Beatitudes, right? A man that's lived the life of the Beatitudes with the ideal of Nietzsche's Overmensch. One of the things that I looked up as I was preparing for this, because again, I don't think we're dealing with guys that are like the Andrew Tates of the world and those that are proponents of like lifting up men, making them stronger, but completely unhinged from any Christian ethical system. I don't think they've quite thought through they haven't, right? Because these people are ignorant of the history. Like when I said they want to return, they're trying to return to something. They're not returning to the Christian ethos, right? They're returning to something older than the Christian ethos. But Nietzsche wanted to return to that. Nietzsche knew what that was, and I give him credit for that. But as I was preparing for this, I looked up on let me make sure I'm telling you this right here, the Satanic Temple's website. And what I did here was I brought up the tenets, the 7 fundamental tenets of the Satanic Temple. And I'm not going to share the screen because I don't even really want to like give these people advertising. They've got this image of skulls and dragons above it. And I think that's supposed to be like scary, which it probably would be scary to like some normie fundamentalist Baptist or something like that. But when Catholics see skulls and dragons, we think it's pretty sweet. Why are you trying to steal our art? But anyways, the Satanic Temple's tenets, their 7 commandments, if you will. I want to read these to you and tell me if you notice anything interesting about these commandments. 1, one should strive to act with compassion and empathy towards all creatures in accordance with reason. 2, the struggle for justice is an ongoing and necessary pursuit that should prevail over laws and institutions. 3, one's body is inviolable, subject to one's own will alone. 4, the freedoms of others should be respected, including the freedom to offend. To willfully and unjustly encroach upon the freedoms of another is to forego one's own. 5, belief should conform to one's scientific understanding of the world. One should take care never to distort scientific facts to fit one's belief. 6, people are fallible. If one makes a mistake, one should do one's best to rectify and resolve any harm that may have been caused. 7, every tenet is a guiding principle designed to inspire nobility in action and thought. The spirit of compassion, wisdom, justice should always prevail over the spoken word. The 7 tenets of the Satanic Temple. Now, you just want to like take these people, these poor, sad people, and just say, hey, can I buy you a Capri Sun? Can I get you a Juicy Juice? Everything's going to be okay. You know, pat them on the shoulder. They try so hard. They really do. Granted, they surely have opened themselves up to demonic influence, but I can imagine, right, in my primitive understanding of demonology, that Satan must assuredly laugh at these kinds of people. The 7 tenets are the work of the emotionally stunted goth kids that I went to school with. Not to mention, it is saturated with a host of Christian presuppositions. They don't even realize that they are in debt. They're talking about autonomy, consent, compassion, objective scientific inquiry, all of these things, right? Now compare that with Nietzsche, with his anti-realist critique of morality. For him, the life of the higher man goes beyond the slavish constraints of such things as good and evil. And at the very least, unlike the incredibly dense and stupid ethics of the Satanic Temple, at the very least, Nietzsche knew what he was combating. And I think it's a much more effective thing that he's talking about. Now, I obviously disagree with Nietzsche's assessment of the problem as well as his solutions, but I think he's pretty accurate in what he says Christianity brought to the world. He'd have laughed just like Satan at the ignoramuses ever at the silly Satanic Temple's attempts at grounding their views of the world in something like justice or compassion or autonomy. So this all comes back around to my initial point. How much violence, how much strength is necessary? Recently, there was a Swiss politician who shot at an image of our mother and Christ child. Her name was Sania Amiti. And she took some kind of pellet gun or something and shot at these images of the Madonna and Christ child. And in response to her subsequent resignation, the Swiss Catholic Women's League stated that Christians, quote, should forgive and condemn sexist, Islamophobic, and xenophobic attacks which Ameti was subjected to since, end quote. Culturally, we have moved well past the point where the Swiss, at least, think there's needs to be men willing to carry out violence on our behalf, telling us that we can't even call upon repugnant politicians to resign when they blaspheme. We're a long, long ways away from the good old days. And don't get I don't want to be misconstrued in any of this. Strong men are important. At times, violent men are important. But we can never lose sight of the fact that Christianity comes with some baggage. Part of the baggage is the ethical framework. What God has said is good and evil, just or unjust, actually truly is, and we have to live within the confines of it. Now, does that mean that at times men will not be called to do violent things? Of course not. But it also means that to, on one side, place as many restrictions on that violence as we can, to ease it back as far as we can, and to acknowledge that maybe those restrictions aren't always feasible, and that maybe at times a man at a certain moment has to go beyond them. But in that case, we always need to keep the door open for this man for whatever wrongs he may or may not have committed or have to commit, the possibility of atonement, of reconciliation. So while I do think that Christianity has to an extent pacified men, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. It has pacified the harsher elements of our often brutal instincts because we are not the alpha nor are we the omega, as I said. We are neither first nor last. We all must lower ourselves. Read the Sermon on the Mount. That's some hard preaching. I'm not worthy of being able to live out most of it righteously on my own. I've had to have a lot of grace and a lot of rethinking and recalibrating. As a matter of fact, I had to turn down the chance to join the secular Franciscans as much as I really loved and wanted to be able to join them for the simple fact that they take a vow of nonviolence. And they always have. And I was, trying to figure if there was some ways that I could sort of curtail it, but while in the long run, while I am willing to lay down my own life nonviolently, I would not ever, and I know this of myself, I would never passively watch my family or others get hurt. I know at an instinctual level, I would end up, if God forbid there were ever a situation where I had to be violent, I would end up stepping in and taking out an aggressor to the best of my ability. So I would end up breaking my vow. But at the same time, I know deep down that those secular Franciscans actually have a holier, closer approach to the gospel than I do myself. They will be counted among the first. Those tough guys out there, those us tough guys, right? I'm gonna include myself in here. You may be the first, you may be the alpha male, but you're last to the kingdom, and that's something to consider when we consider the fact of what Christianity has to say about um, manhood in general. And so I hope this has been interesting for you guys. Again, hopefully, maybe it's some new perspective. I try to bring some new perspective to some of these things. I do. I said at the beginning that I acknowledge that there's a problem. There is a problem with manhood. It has been debased. It has been. When we get to the point where men couldn't even stand up and even peacefully deal with a politician that is publicly shooting images of Our Lady and the Christ child, for Catholics then to turn and say that we should actually apologize to her for calling out her and blaspheming her and telling her to step down. We've come a long way from the days where, we were dealing with how to help the soldiers and the knights and the fighters and the defenders of Christendom deal with some of the actual horrific things that they had to do on behalf of society in general. So again, I think that like via Medea, that middle way. On the one extreme, we don't want men unhinged from Christian ethics out there being the alphas and doing these things without any context of the ethics that we would find in something like the Sermon of the Mount. Especially the men that are called to do violence, should have the Sermon of the Mount in the back of their minds at all times, and have how, if if you're like, say, a police officer, for example, and you might be called upon to shoot a man and kill a man, or whatever the case may be, to do violence, to always have it in the back of your mind, how am I going to atone for that? Because even though, and this is what they wrestled with, even though it might be necessary for to do harm to this other human being for the sake of preserving, my life, the life of loved ones, the life of the innocent, whatever, it's still objectively a breaking of the commandment. And these men saw it as there was going to be residual effect that would have to be paid for in purgatory. And so, again, that's why the Crusades was, for the first time, it was like, oh, I can do this thing that I've trained to do. And not only is it just, as fighting should always be just when you do it, but not only is it just for the cause of the glory of the kingdom and the return of the Holy Land, but also the residual punishment, the temporal punishment due to me for the acts that I'm committing, will be cleared through the indulgence. Okay, so that's all I've got for you today, guys. I hope you enjoyed that. It's good to be back. I don't see really any questions or anything in the comments. Um, I have missed doing this, and I hope to have some other ones here in the near future. If you guys have any ideas for some stuff, I've kind of like just gotten settled into my new place, and I don't necessarily. I usually have like a stack of ideas of things that I would want to like cover on these lives, but I don't necessarily have that stack ready to go right now. So if you guys have anything in particular, comments, hey, would you be willing to talk about this or that and the other? And who knows, I may just cover it. Until the meantime, in the meantime, God bless you all and take care.